Yeah. Wow. Oh, that's right. Okay. The path to fixing racial prejudice and racial injustice is a question that people have been asking themselves for ages. And luckily for me, my degree of psychology is actually useful here. Because at OG, we're going to prove to you that contact theory is the only tenable way in order to solve these racial conflicts that have existed over a millennia. First thing I'm going to do is establish what we're actually trying to do. I think what we're going to do is incentivize people to move through things like tax exemptions, rent subsidies. And notably, the people that are buying into this are likely going to be young families who are already going to move away from their parents anyway. So we think that this is probably a process that is going to happen over a decade or a few decades. This is something that's probably going to take a while. I think that's pretty reasonable. But secondly, we would also just point out this is neighborhoods. So if any argument wants to be like, oh, people want to talk to people in their cultures, that's probably something you can have access to. That's something pretty reasonable because this is a neighborhood. This isn't like a huge city. There probably aren't that many barriers from stopping you from doing that. The first point of substantive we're going to push is how this fixes racism. Woohoo. The first thing we're going to talk about is Jason Allport's theory of contact theory. The first thing that needs to be met for contact theory to work is positive interactions. And notably, we posit that these things are pretty likely because these people have been told that they are fundamentally different from other people. They've been given a message that the other is bad. We tell you that at the point at which we don't even need these interactions to be good, we just need them to be fairly normal. We just need to be every day. And that contrast in what you perceive to be that contrast in interaction from what you perceive to be negative to something that's pretty fine is something that is probably going to be beneficial. The second way in which we fulfill contact theory is through collective goals. In that neighborhood, you just do have the collective goal for that neighborhood to be safe for your children to run around in. You do have the incentive for that neighborhood to be prosperous, not filled with crime, and that functioning of that neighborhood is a collective goal that these people will work towards. But finally, we would also just push that this model is incentivized by an authority, and when this is when interactions are incentivized by an authority, that is something that is likely for them to get them to behave better or whatever. But secondly, we just point out in the status quo, you just don't know about other people. You are far more easily able to abstract from these other people because they live on the other side of the city or they live on the other side of the country. And what that enables people to do is do things like vote in prejudicial ways or vote for harmful things and all that sort of thing. Yeah, closing.
Contact theory doesn't work when you have competition. You think people start moving into other neighborhoods people want to move over. All that is not equal status and power.
But everyone has access to those subsidies, right? So it's unclear what the competition for resources actually is going to be. But additionally, that's not the only that might mitigate the extent to which our contact theory works. But I think it's pretty plausible. But additionally, if OO or Opbench wants to claim that these people are stuck in their way so badly, contact theory is just empirically shown to be particularly effective for children. And we think that to the extent of which that this debate happens over a couple decades, we think that the extent to which that these preconceived prejudicial thought is likely to go down. Final mechanism of how we prevent racism is we are taking away a message for politicians to use, because now politicians can no longer prey on your fears. They can no longer rely on you not knowing about the other. And this is a political message that is not that is pretty potent in the status quo that we are removing from the status quo. But importantly, a lot of ethnic and religious divides aren't just that obvious, right? It's just not obvious in most instances that people are from other backgrounds because they just do look similarly to you, and the only difference is religious differences. And we would posit that in these instances specifically, contact theory is going to be the most effective because you realize after you've known someone for a couple months or a year, you then realize that they were different from you, but then it didn't matter because you didn't know they were different from you in the first place. What are the impacts of this argument? I think that the impacts of this argument are relatively massive because now you do care about those other people. You vote in positive ways. You don't enable a government to do things like genocidal actions, but you also remedy generational divides that have happened over decades and decades. So at the end of this argument, it's not enough for OO and Opbench to point out that there is racism right now. We prove to you that racism will go down in the future eventually, and in our worst case, through the mechanism of children being exposed to other children and thinking that is fine. So it's not enough for them to just point out that racism exists in the status quo. Before I move on, anyone else got a point?
Yeah, absolutely. Which part of America, the north or south, is on average more racist?
like the South, but like presumably people are moving. So I don't know. Cool. The second piece of substantive that we're going to push at OG is about equality. Noting at the outset that this argument isn't contingent on any proof about racism or the extent of it, because in the status quo, what we identify is that government resources and private like individual resources are not diversified at all. Because in the status quo, there is generally one group with power, whether that be through financial power or political bloc. And the impact of that is that now you have schools that are especially funded in those areas. You have government funding and support being tunneled into those areas exclusively. You do have things like over policing in those areas with like the high amounts, like high concentrations of that ethnic minority. And on the counterfactual, these resources just are dispersed because political blocs and voting blocs are dispersed. Racial enclaves can't be specifically targeted anymore because they are dispersed. And importantly, schools are like public resources like schools and things are just better for everyone. And the way in which we think this would probably like pan out is that you have pre-existing schools in these areas, and maybe some of them are worse and some of them are better. You would probably like the people in the political majority would probably just lobby their governments to bring up the quality of the worst schools that they are now in the proximity of. Let's say OO is like, oh, there's going to be some sort of apartheid say as a result of this. I think that this is just extremely unlikely because I think it's just completely untenable to build like literally twice the amount of schools or do segregation, noting that apartheid is generally something that is extremely unpopular just like within these nations in the short term, but also on the international stage. We think that apartheid is something that is far less likely to happen. The impact of this argument is pretty huge as well, because we prove to you that governments are now not able to target these minorities as much. We tell you that these minorities now have far better access to resources that they wouldn't have otherwise, and that was particularly important. Weighing our substantive pushes now, we tell you that in Ops bench case, racism is a short-term harm. We prove to you that over time, with these positive interactions, with these collective goals of keeping your neighborhood a safe and protected environment, this is something that gets people to work together. But so we tell you that in the long term, racism and this problem that like leads to the deaths of millions of people is something that will get resolved. But secondly, we would point out to you that the equality of resources and giving these minorities a chance to have access to resources where on the counterfactual they otherwise wouldn't, that was something important. And additionally, not contingent on any not contingent on the extent of racism in that country. And for all those reasons, vote OG.
Thanks, Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition.
Cool. In terms of POIs, I'll take them in the chat from CG, and obviously you guys can just stand. In these contexts, often minority enclave communities developed as a form of self-defense to the immense oppression and overreach of the state. Government bench would have that same state intervene again to rip those communities apart. I'm going to make three arguments. Firstly, explaining why this worsens the social aspect of communities, then explaining how this massively degrades minority cultures, finally explaining why this worsens political capital for minorities in these contexts. Before that, I'm going to do two things in setup. Firstly, I'm going to chat about what this policy looks like. I think obviously, as the word in the motion is require, GovBench probably does need to stand for something that is relatively punitive. This is not simply about providing incentives. It is about, in the worst cases and in some instances, being relatively forceful in implying and like ensuring these things happen. I would note as well, often these specific communities have very bad histories with the state and other things like oppression. And I would lastly suggest that often these like communities that are ethnically diverse are often post-colonial or do have a history of ethnic kitchens and those types of things just empirically. That's when they say, oh, we're going to do this over time in a really, really nudgy and gentle way. I think this runs away from their burden a little bit, but also massively decreases the scale of their benefits, right? I don't think a couple subsidies are going to be able to solve racism as they want to claim. In terms of the counterfactual, I think it's much easier just to directly inject these resources into the minority communities in terms of improving the services that are available to them. I think that's mutually exclusive for two reasons. One, the F word fiat, but secondly, I think it's seen as solving the same problem in terms of like, oh, like getting integration, improving the outcomes for those minorities. First argument now, explaining why this worsens the social aspect of these communities. The first part of this argument I'm going to explain is why this is perceived badly by majoritarian groups who notably are just more structurally powerful in these contexts. The first thing that I would suggest is that often these things often have a bad history of ethnic tensions in these contexts, and that is often because colonial systems impose things like divide and rule, which artificially inflamed these sorts of tensions and made these groups not like each other that much. But the second thing that it does quite badly in terms of why it's perceived badly is also this plays into existing narratives about, oh, minorities are going to come into communities and are going to steal your jobs and are going to be in your schools and are going to be a threat to your children, which is something that is incredibly emotive and plays into those narratives, which notably are incredibly entrenched. But the third thing I would suggest is often the transition into these communities is particularly difficult. It is just at the best of times quite hard to move house generally, but it's incredibly harder when you're moving into an unfamiliar community who's likely to be unfriendly for you, and also the people who opt into their subsidies, who the monetary stuff is the most important for, are not the most privileged members of that minority group. They do tend to be the more vulnerable members who that monetary stuff is much more important for, which means that the people they actually get contact theory with are the ones who are most likely to concur with negative stereotypes that minority groups, that majoritarian groups necessarily have. That enables confirmation bias and gives legitimacy to the claim that about a lot of those negative stereotypes, because you can say, hey, I've seen it in my community, I've seen it in the street. The second part of this argument is explaining why this just doesn't improve over time. The first thing I would suggest is that you don't have meaningful interactions, and that's why Xavier's POI is particularly important, because although there are a whole lot more Black people in the south of the US and all of those types of things, that obviously they were much more racist than the North. That proves that just seeing someone in the street or maybe shopping at the same supermarket is an insufficient mechanism for getting contact theory and actually breaking down those racism things. Their claim on contact theory here, I would just suggest that it just needs to be incredibly meaningful, rather than just seeing it in the street, or maybe then just even in their case of children. I think parents in these communities, when they are relatively scared, when there's a perception that a minority group is coming in, are likely to indoctrinate their children in a particularly pernicious way and do those narratives there. Okay. And the second thing I would suggest under why it doesn't improve is just the people who control the levers of these communities tend to be most conservative. The people who maybe are more traditional and have time to stay at home and go onto PTA boards and control things like school policy. Religious institutions, which are important for organizing, often tends to be a little bit more conservative. So those people who actually control those communities have an incentive to lock up those minority communities. The final thing I would suggest under this argument is that even if the services provision improves on their side, you are unable to access a lot of those services as a minority community, and the mechanism here is just gentrification, right? And that when people come into your area, that drives up prices, things like rent, which makes it incredibly hard in terms of the cost of living for these communities. The outcomes of this are relatively simple. Minorities feel unsafe in their own communities and they break the safe space. I'd love to take CG.
Is getting access to the capital of housing prices increasing in wealthy suburbs useful for class mobility?
I didn't quite understand that POI, but I think essentially you're only able to have class mobility when you have a strong community backing you, when you have a community that is important and uplifting you. That is what they destroy on GovBench. Second argument about why this leads to the cultural degradation of these minority cultures. The first thing I would suggest is that a lot of these cultures are particularly important in that they shape in response to the oppression that these groups have commonly suffered together, and in a particularly important way. That means they're likely to be strong, that's likely to be particularly good. I would note as well that the important thing with these cultures is that they are concentrated, that you go outside and you see people who look like you and that you feel included in that space, as opposed to you just being 10% of that neighborhood. It is incredibly difficult to drive all the way across the city and try and collect people together in a concentration, which is a prerequisite to actually making that culture something that is incredibly strong. I think on their side of the house, the majoritarian groups imposes different cultural norms on those groups. One, through mechanisms like hard power, literally just using mechanisms like the police and the state. The fact that that like crack cocaine and powder cocaine have different like laws, as OG explained in our previous debate. But I think the second thing to suggest is often soft power exists in terms of like creating norms and discourse about what like cultures like look like, and that you are more likely to get children in those communities wanting to like aspire to that majoritarian culture in a way that like fundamentally degrades that culture in a way that is quite bad. The last thing I'm going to explain is why this worsens the political capital for these minority communities in clash with OG here. I think lots of elections occur by district. One, this is empirically true, but the reason for that is that the Westminster English system, through processes of colonization, was exported to the world. And even if like you do have some that are like proportional on national level, like in Australia maybe, the like more like local representation is often done regionally. What they essentially do is that they break up minorities as a voting bloc, because you aren't able to get like people in when you have like more than 50% of a community being able to vote in someone who looks like you. If you have like only 20% of every single district, that means you have like 0% in terms of that representation that's politically important. But the final thing I would suggest under political capital is that you take away the ability to organize organically within your own community through institutions like churches and those types of things that were particularly important in the South. So proud to stand in opening opposition.
Thanks. Hello, Debbie Prime Minister. Sorry, I'm going to need a minute to organize my pages. Small desk. First thing the speech is going to deal with is very quickly their point on our model and whether it's right, because they say it needs to be forceful because we require these communities to be. We have fiat to suggest how this policy is implemented. So long as you believe that this policy means these communities do meet the threshold of the model, then obviously that's how the debate takes place. Also, obviously, this debate does take place over time. We were never forced to uproot families in the short term. I think incentives was a very reasonable interpretation of the debate. So then, two parts of the speech: firstly on discrimination, secondly on equality, and a piece of new substantive if I have time. On discrimination, what do we tell you? We tell you that divides around ethnicity, religion, and race exist because of distance, because it's easy to believe that your group is superior in the absence of contact. Their contest here is to say that contact won't be meaningful, but I think it definitely is. Because when you live next door to people of a different ethnicity, when your kids go to the same school as theirs and become friends, when you form romantic connections across those races, obviously these were meaningful connections that happen in your day-to-day life, and you would realize you had far more in common than you did difference. Because these divides weren't real, they were tools of social and political leaders to hold on to their power. They were tools of the media because division gets views, and they were tools of the elite to maintain their hold on power. We removed that tool. Their push here is that like you're going to play into narratives. These people are moving into your area, taking your jobs and stuff. The first thing I'm going to point out here is the difference between the short-term harm that they explain here and the long-term benefit we're able to claim, because obviously their mechanism here is like, oh, this confirmation of stereotypes because poorer people move in. Obviously, firstly, a rent subsidy is a percentage of the rent you would pay, and therefore it's unclear these people would be poorer. And also, obviously, white people are also moving into primarily minority communities in those contexts. So obviously that didn't work in that way. But I think the long-term, short-term way up is very important, because their only mechanism for racism was stereotypes. But obviously stereotypes will be proven wrong into the long term, because when these people are able to access equality more, that means they're able to prove these things wrong and to defeat those stereotypes. This analysis was never able to flip out of claims on how racism is defeated. It was quite poor mitigation. The next claim here is just on culture. They say that you can't preserve culture within these communities, but because you're breaking up. But obviously this was just a neighborhood, so it's unclear it was prohibitive to important cultural things. I think the way this actually plays out is just you exist within your culture, but not exclusively within it, and that your neighborhood is diverse. But obviously you could still visit and
your religious institution, have those connections and maintain them to whatever importance it was within your life. Onto then equality. And I think this is really important because it's really concrete and obviously super high impact. And I point out that this isn't contingent on anything else in the debate, because even if racism persisted, we explain that we tackled the deprivation by reducing the additional disadvantages that face families when they're concentrated in communities of their disprivileged minority in a poor neighborhood. That is defeated to the point at which you just have what our model says you will. What does this actually look like? It looks like schools being better funded. It looks like local taxes, meaning you fund local infrastructure better because you don't have that gap in the amount people pay in taxes. It means that infrastructure is going to be pushed for within all communities equally because it's lobbied and pushed for by rich people that want their roads to be good and don't really care if it means that a minority also has good roads. It means that these people are more able to have connections and that the people that hold positions of power now live next door to you and you're able to form those things and go to school with them, which means that you're not locked out of barriers into those things by nepotism. These benefits matter because education and connections are ways out of poverty for people, because infrastructure and public and otherwise do improve people's everyday lives. Their push here is to be like you won't be viewed as equals. But the first thing I'd point out is this obviously fades over time. And secondly, these model obviously also includes white people moving in, the majority ethnic group also moving into minority neighborhoods. The third thing I would point out is this does nothing to our claim, because if you want good roads and you want a good education for your kids, you necessarily have to provide those, and those will exist for everyone. And that is the benefit. They say you won't be able to access it because of gentrification. I think this was really under-mechanized. They just say that the rent might go up, but obviously there is no increased demand for rent in one area, demand for housing in one area, because people are moving in and out at the same rates. I don't think that mechanism makes any sense. The final claim here is their best one. It's to say that you now have much less voting power because you've now no longer with people that are likely to vote your way. The first thing I would point out is where these problems exist, it is unclear that you had voting power in the first instance, because if you did, you probably wouldn't be facing the same amount of discrimination that we explain and inequality that we explain we're able to solve, but also because it's very easy for things like gerrymandering to mean that you don't have that voting power even when you live within that community. What we explain to you though is others will vote in your interest, and that and because once you share a neighborhood, your interests are their interests, and that means that you're maybe there are some things you would have different policies on, and maybe it's slightly less effective, but at the point at which you're able to get a good education, you're able to break out of that poverty. That means you're able to claim all of those benefits into the long run. I'll take a point from closing, preferably with your extension.
The point on gerrymandering and other voting interests, I really think white people could understand it as facing minorities vote to have more than say
Okay, yeah, but obviously it's not like, oh, black people want less funding in schools. Obviously you just want funded schools and you want hospitals in your area and everyone will vote for those things. The point at which the lobbying power and the prioritization is spread across all communities, that means that things that are in everyone's interest, which are the base things that people lack, that is access to healthcare and education. Those things are provided at a base rate, and those things enable you to access the privilege, and that means you're able to push for other things into the long run. Obviously, what we were claiming here is you could claim the things that you needed as a prerequisite to get anything else. Final thing in this speech then, new substantive. What I'm going to explain here is this model brings capital into poorer neighborhoods because those subsidies mean that more privileged people will move into more disprivileged neighborhoods. Those people bring money that can set up businesses that mean that you have jobs within your neighborhood that are high paying, so you don't have to travel from a poorer community in order to access them, but also just that you're able to access them because you live next to them. But also consumers of local businesses that already exist there, because you have people in there that now have more money that they can spend, which means that local businesses in these areas are able to survive. The benefit here is really clear. It's that we are able to spread economic prosperity across different ethnicities in a way the upbench could never claim they did. What do you know at the end of opening government? We tell you that over time, racism will fade away and the discrimination that hurts people's day-to-day lives fades. We tell you that we're able to get equality in the base access to resources to prerequisite for anything else in the debate. That is an enormous benefit that we're able to claim in the short term, because these things are likely to change the minute these people move into neighborhoods and find out the taps don't have good water. What we explained to you, this necessarily is the biggest contribution in the debate, because it didn't matter if there was going to be a bit more racism experience in the short term, so long as you could fix all of these problems into the long term. And that is why I'm very proud to propose.
Thanks, Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
All right. Oh, better get my phone. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Prime Minister wants to use his psychology degree to survey what might happen. Unfortunately for government bench, I have a completed history degree to explain what actually happened every single time we have adopted this policy. Contact theory failed in Rwanda in the 80s, America in the 50s, Australia since the 1910s, South Africa since 1992, and Latin America since the 1800s. It is a historically unsuccessful policy. It will fail again this time. It is an attempt to fix structural problems with non-structural solutions. It will never, ever work. Firstly, on government's model, I would note that, we didn't say that model is illegitimate. We note that they take a soft burden because require proves that there must be something of an advance in this policy. The reason they figured this in as slow is because they know no one wants to move. What that necessarily concedes is that there's going to be a level of resentment from every single person who moves into one of these communities. Not everyone will just be willing to do this. If you want diverse communities, you're going to have to act to take them. That is going to be deeply, deeply unpopular when you remove the ethnic homogeneity that exists in many of these societies right now. No, thank you. Firstly, they make some long-term claims that they're going to be don't worry, we're going to fix it in the long term. Panel, this is just empirically untrue. There are long-term trends of change towards less homogeneity in the status quo. But what that is necessarily contingent on is treating cultures as equals. To no response, we tell you at Allo, this policy will destroy cultures. It will destroy minority cultures in a way that they can never be equal. It will not be a question of assimilation. It will be a question of destruction. Firstly, on why contact theory doesn't work, then on political capital, then for some reason why DPM just accepts that there'll be gentrification, and finally on how that actually nukes the CG extension that they give us at POI. All right. Firstly, on the question of contact theory, we're told it exists because of distance. The first mechanism for this is that there'll be positive interaction. So we're told that racism exists because of difference between people. The first mechanism we're given to fix this is that there'll be positive interactions. Unfortunately for government, they can't figure in that these interactions will be positive, and they provide no structural analysis as to why it's likely to be positive. Here's some reasons, panel, why it's likely to not be positive. The first is very simple. You have a history of ethnic tensions in a lot of these countries. These are people who you do not see as equal to yourself or similar to yourself or of equal value to yourself. Next, you probably dislike this policy because, as we explain in just discussing how this motion works, you have to be forcing people who wouldn't otherwise move. That means there are going to be people who resent this because they do not like the community. They have not grown up believing that that is a sort of community that they want to live in, who move in there. Not right now, thank you. There's just also cultural differences which continue to exist. You have your own unique culture, which is based on where you have grown up, how you have lived your life experience. You necessarily cannot live that out in the same way. So you will likely resent that, which will mean these interactions that they necessarily need to claim are positive will not be. I would note that the probably likely example of this is busing children in Boston in the 1980s in America, where from dominant African-American communities, children were bused in to more privileged white schools. Do you know what happened there, panel? It didn't make everyone love the African-American community. It subjected children to horrific racism from that dominant community. It subjected children to the most unbelievable conditions that you could imagine, which meant that it was abandoned in 6 months. That's the sort of policy which GovBench stands behind. Their next explanation for why you're likely to be similar is you have shared desires. This is just a lie. You obviously have self-interest, which if you do not believe these people are equal to you, you will actualize at their expense. Note that looks like things like gentrification. Note that looks like things like jacking up rents. All these sort of things are actually going to harm the community on net. If you do not relate to these people, if because you have grown up believing that they are not alike to you, it's deeply, deeply unclear why you suddenly have shared values. They then tell you finally that these incentives exist. We explain why incentives are not actually sufficient for getting over the necessary cultural problems. But note, panel, even if you don't believe any of my responses, PM just concedes that contact theory doesn't work at POI because we show you that the most racially integrated communities exist in the South, where there are also the highest levels of racism. The reasons for that are not particularly complex. It's because racism pervades in ways which aren't just about not knowing people. It pervades because of harmful narratives about who is better and what cultures are more valuable. This is actually what creates racism, not some not knowing people. I'll now take opening government.
Yeah, your only mechanism for racism is that stereotypical confirmation bias playing into racism. Do you think that the myth that white people can't eat spicy food is real?
Some white people can't eat spicy food, some white people can eat spicy food. So I'm happy to say that that myth is not real. But you do not seriously think that's what this debate is about, right? Because it is not about easily disprovable stereotypes. It's about fundamentally ingrained beliefs which you have been told since you were a child and have been socialized to believe in your superiority. That's actually what this debate is about. So, next, onto the OG political capital push. OG explains that this unlocks political capital for improvements. Obviously, that is contingent on you believing that political capital doesn't just continue to favour the dominant groups. I would note there are 7 reasons why political capital does continue to favour the dominant groups. Firstly, dominant groups are just likely in power on a national level in these countries. They're going to support policies which favour their voter base, which is, surprise, surprise, the dominant ethnic group. Secondly, the local levers of power, as Guy explains, belong to the most privileged people, the people who probably have the most affinity with the people in power. Thirdly, the use of the state apparatus like the police force is always going to be biased in favour of the dominant group. Fourthly, this is an enormous amount of political capital expended in the first place. We're not sure that you actually even get back to that level. Fifthly, we explain that this ruins districting. You get no actual representation because it's now much, much harder to vote in for someone who just represents you and your community on a national level. Sixthly, we tell you that it removes the ability to organise on a local level. It's much, much harder to be activistic when there are people who are opposing your activism around every corner, when there are people in every single part of your city who are going to rat you out to the police and explain what sort of activism you're going to do. Seventhly, there's just an existing policy trend towards less gerrymandering, so it's good for them to be concentrated. All right then. On to the DLO sort of extension material on gentrification. And I know this is probably just done to burn the POI that comes out from CG. So we'll take them both at once. Because note, firstly, they just concede that gentrification exists under their policy. So if you believe that gentrification is a bad thing, you necessarily side with opposition in this debate. Secondly, we agree with the mechanism provided by CG that prices are likely to increase. But note, you don't have the capital likely as a member of the excluded community to buy them. What this actually means is dominant groups buy the property, your rent goes up, which makes it vastly, vastly harder for you to live in the community, which is safe for you. Note what we explain at the end of this. This worsens social interactions in these communities, it reduces your political capital, and it severely, severely harms the last bastion of these minority groups' cultures, which we must protect. Proud to be in opposition.
Thanks, DLO. Government member.
Am I audible to everyone in the room?
Yeah, you're audible.
I think the opening half of this debate focuses way too much on racism. Because notice, when you are a minority living in a country, I don't think the mean words hurt you as much as not being able to put food on the table. I don't think they hurt as much as not being able to find a job that you are highly qualified for because of the discrimination you face, because you could never live in an area where you could commute to work on time. 4 things in my speech today. First, I'm going to give you an extension on how we uniquely improve housing and economic mobility, which is the most important thing in this debate. Then I'm going to give you a second principle, a second extension that is principled on why we need to give reparative change to minorities and Indigenous people within these countries. Finally, I'm going to deal with the 2 OO claims, firstly on why you won't integrate well, secondly on the cultural washing. Firstly, then, our first extension on housing and economic inequality. Note the only thing our opening half really gave you on this was that, like, now you could do things like have better schools and you could have better voting blocks. We're going to tell you about individual mobility, which is far more important for the average minority living in these countries. What does this look like? I think the first piece of context here is due to things like redlining and stolen land and historic wealth. The areas that are the closest to like the metropolitan hubs, where the most jobs are available, where the wages are higher, where there's a better quality of life, generally have very, very high housing prices. The second piece of context to note here is if you are an ethnic minority, oftentimes it's very hard for you to get into these communities, A, because of those very, very high prices, and secondly, because you don't really have an incentive to, because of the fact that you feel like you were always framed out if you will be the only brown person in the room. This policy fixes both of those issues. Firstly, provides you with a subsidy in order to get into those communities in the first place. It gives you cheaper rent that you can afford to be in the places you would like to be to access those jobs. The second problem it fixes is it means you're not going to be the only brown person in the entire place. Because it isn't just about introducing 10 brown people into a community. It's about matching the ethnic redistribution of the entire country. In a lot of ethnically diverse countries, there's not one gigantic majority. That means that in a lot of these communities that are redistributed, you're going to have a world where you have maybe 30% of one community that may be racist or predominantly white, and lots of other ethnic minorities. This means you still feel like you have some level of mobility within ethnic diversity because you still have other people who do not fit the ethnic majority. Both those problems are fixed. What are the benefits you get as a result of this? Firstly, it means you're able to access more jobs and better opportunities. This is true because at the point at which people don't want to commute massively for jobs, when you move into a new community and when people are moving out of those communities, they try to look for new jobs that are approximately closer to them. That means opportunities open up both in the community, but also most higher end communities where lots of white people live tend to be in areas that are more convenient. For example, areas that are closer to ports and transport hubs and things like metropolitan cities. That is really good because it means two things. Firstly, it means you're able to access the convenience of being able to get to those jobs on time. It means you aren't going to get fired because you weren't able to make your job on time because you live 50 minutes away in a developing area, which is the only place you could get a house. The second thing it means is because people are now becoming more aware, because even in the lowest burden of this debate, if people still are racist, but they're more used to seeing a brown person, they don't see the same shock factor because they also have to live in a neighborhood where they see these people every day, where they see you as competent and capable because like at least 20% of the people around them are from the same city that you are. That has massive impacts for every single person who is able to access redistribution. Firstly, it means you are economically better off. It means you are able to make better decisions for you and your family. Notice it's a far higher burden than our opening half took because it isn't just about your kids being able to go to better schools. It's about you being able to pick which schools your kids go to because you can now pay for a better school if you wish to. It's about what jobs you're able to access and the career progression you're able to have over time. We don't just rely on people being able to access government welfare. We instead give them greater opportunities to mobilize in the long term over multiple generations, which is the largest benefit in this debate. The second extension we're going to give you today is a principled extension. The main context here is the reason that oftentimes neighborhoods are gentrified the way they are, distribution is done the way it is because historically land was taken from Indigenous people and minority communities because it was seen as high value land. They were told it was going to be used for a military base, or they were told they were going to buy it off of them, and they later sold it off for higher prices, overdeveloped it, and they framed it out at high prices so the same people could never come back to their own land that they originally lived in or their ancestors lived on. We think this was abhorrent in so many different ways, and there is a principled obligation by the government to give this land back. And that is done through things like subsidies. It's done through low, where the government paying part of your mortgage if you choose to move there. It's done through things like punitive measures. That is the burden we do have to take, where the people who benefit from things like colonization are slowly moved off that land to give you a way to get in. That is really important because not only does it give practical benefits to these people, but it also fulfills a larger post-colonial reparative principle that we are the only side that is able to support and stand for. Massive, massive benefits that span over hundreds and hundreds of years of pain and forceful removal and all of those harms. So notice that outweighs any harms are able to be proved by OO when they tell us, oh, your people are not going to like this or they're going to have resentment. Notice people are probably always going to have resentment with any kind of reparative policy or any kind of policy to restore racism, because that's what racists like to do. They like to speak out and be angry. So note, if they believe that is the largest harm in this debate, they have to stand against all policy that does anything to racism. And that's really, really harmful because it means you always live with racism. Before I deal with the two OO claims and explain why we come on top, I'll take that POI.
Often minority communities exist in the inner cities due to the redlining that you explained. These are the closest to economic opportunities that can uplift them. Now you rip them away from them.
I don't think that's necessarily true, right? I think when you have ethnic minorities moving in, they have to move into the place that are cheapest. That's because when you're an immigrant and your currency is worth a lot less than the currency of the place you're moving to, you have to find the cheapest possible rent. And the cheapest possible rent is not in inner cities. So the minorities you're talking about are probably the ones that are already financially well off because they get to access opportunities. I think minorities exist in a plethora of different circumstances, and we help the ones that are the least privileged. Okay. Two claims made to it by OO. Firstly, people won't integrate well. Secondly, on cultural washing. I'll deal with the second one first because I think it's the only relevant one. We have two main responses. Firstly, I don't think the cultural congregation exists the way they think it does, right? Because notice they didn't give us a mechanism as to why this cultural congregation exists. They just told us people live in the same places, they have culture. This isn't necessarily true for two reasons. Firstly, because ethnic minorities have a spectrum of how minor they are. You have some minorities that make up maybe 2% of the entire country's ethnic makeup, and you have some that make up 30%. The larger minorities are obviously spread across a lot of different places due to the fact that when they initially immigrated, because most of these minorities get there through immigration, they had to go to different places based on where their opportunities were. Because of things like racism, they could only get lower paying jobs or start their own businesses in faraway places that are least developed. That means they oftentimes are spread out, and in order to have any congregation, they still have to move across places. But that means you don't actually have that massive change when they have to now move to access their community and their culture. Second thing, though, is you can't have activism anymore because you are no longer in the same groups. because the activism you have, even if you are a community in a small place, if you are an incredibly poor community, the activism is always going to be less impactful than if you have people with more money that are more spread out, because activism does take place in congregated areas where people come in from lots of different places. We're so proud to stand for reparation.
Thanks, Governor Member. Also, I think that might be fairly sensitive, so you can probably just give it away.
Just checking I can be heard. Okay. Yeah, assume it's all good. Okay. CEO was going to explain why in the immediate short term, when you move into these communities, it's incredibly hard for you to be able to access the things that maximize your social mobility, that maximize your quality of life. In fact, they probably do the most detriment to your quality of life because you can't access things like quality food, healthcare, and schools the same way that these other rich neighborhoods could. This is something that has a generational impact as well, because that entrenches the problems that already exist. That is something we're going to concretize at CEO. And then also some additional stuff on cultural diaspora communities and responsiveness to that eye contact theory. Okay, firstly, in vertical extension, explaining why it is incredibly hard for the community, the people who move into these communities. Because I think OO does say the word gentrification, raising the rents of these communities. I think that is potentially one mechanism that exists here. But and they also explain some like stuff about soft power and like bias and confirmation bias in these communities. But I think we explained the structural reasons why you are likely to be moving into a community that is much more likely to be wealthier than the one that you were originally from, something where you're going to be priced out of the vast majority of services that are needed to sustain life, and that is something that is incredibly important. What is the framing here? I think it's just quite likely that because of like a variety of structural reasons that racial minorities have like, you know, a significantly less capital, like I guess money and resources and capital and so on. And that is for a variety of reasons. For example, generational stolen labor that came through slavery or being paid lower wages. That looks like, for example, a huge amount of intergenerational trauma that leads to it being harder for you to do work and so on as well. And this is incredibly important as well, because the weighing here shows why these subsidies probably don't work in like accessing these sorts of things. Okay, what do these rich communities look like, and why that disparity between why this disparity when they move to those richer neighborhoods, because, you know, again, they're probably moving from areas that have lower capital. What do they look like? First of all, I think these richer areas just tend to have less priority on important public services. That looks like, for example, in the US and even in Australia, actually, I'm pretty sure the Eastern Suburbs only has one public school or like one of the districts. Those are incredibly important for you to be able to access your education in the first place. And you are like just simply aren't able to where that free education exists. I think that additionally looks like things like having less free or bulk billed healthcare, for example, because you are just priced out of those services because they maybe only have specialists or people who are family doctors and so on. I think additionally in those public services, like richer communities just tend to have less public transport because they want to gatekeep their communities by like, you know, only being able to access them by car. So therefore, you know, you keep the riffraff out, for example, and they do actively advocate against these. For example, having trains through their communities, having buses that allow people to like move without a car, something that is notably very expensive to be able to maintain. And I think fourthly, there's just the availability of the types of jobs that you either train for or the types of jobs that you want to engage in. I would note that probably in like more suburban and more privileged richer communities definitely have more of a priority on things like professional, like, you know, service jobs and so on. If you are trained in something that is like more like, you know, commerce or like, like retail or hospitality or something that is more in manufacturing, going going to these sorts of neighborhoods significantly reduces your ability to even access that economy as well. And I would also note, thirdly, there is the private businesses that you are able to access in order to do things like access food and groceries and so on are also additionally far, far more expensive in these sorts of communities. I think that explains that these are probably likely to price out minorities out of essential services that are things that are going to be incredibly important to their quality of life and being able to access, maximize their quality of life in these areas. The OG claim here is that actually this is going to get better because now the government has incentive to equalize these resources because they aren't just like all white people living in certain areas that have the most power. But I think, first of all, I think I would just note that this is probably irrelevant because this is the sort of harm that occurs in the short term. Obviously, the time it takes to divert funds to build a new school or to do to start a new train line takes an incredibly long amount of time. Those sorts of things, and this sort of harm is likely to occur in the first generation of people who move here. But also the government doesn't have control over necessarily all of these things. For example, the sorts of private businesses that set up there. And I would weigh this short-term impact on people who have to engage in a world where they have less ability to, they have to pay way more for their food or for their education, because that is a generation of people who are going to suffer significantly, in addition to probably the racism they face in that community, because that entrenches disadvantage, because that means they won't be able, you have to come back from that when you are able to access those services as well. But secondly, I would just say that this claim is probably incorrect, that you are going to distribute these services evenly, because firstly, there are still going to be rich and poor neighborhoods in this conception, right? Which means the most powerful people who live in those richer neighborhoods where you might be priced out still have the ability to advocate for things advocate against things like public transport, because their land is more valuable and the government collects more taxes on them and so on. And because they want to gatekeep their communities, they still have the incentive to do that, because I think it's been pretty definitively explained why contact theory is unlikely to work here. They don't want to have things like more manufacturing industries in their communities. They don't want to have certain types of professions. They don't want those sorts of things. And that is something they are still very able to advocate against, because they are still the most rich people in here. And honestly, that is the thing that really actually gets anything done in politics, the ability to lobby. That is the most important. What is the impact in here? I think what this looks like is these communities are going to be incredibly detrimental and entrench the disadvantage that racial minorities already experience in these communities. That is something that is not only an incredibly concrete benefit, I think it is incredibly certain in the short term when these people move there. I think it is also something that does accrue disadvantage over time. Before that, I'll take OG.
Yeah, if these people wouldn't have enough money to live better lives when they moved into these communities, then they wouldn't move into these communities. As well with the PM, the incentives, the subsidies, grandfather.
Because you require them to move into these communities. I'm sorry, the incentive point is just taking way too low a burden for your team. They are required to move into particular communities. Maybe some white people are required to move into racial minority communities at the moment. That obviously has a host of other disadvantages that have been pretty soundly litigated, I think. You are just being compelled. I think this is I want to say additionally as to why it is likely to be bad to live in these communities. And I suppose this is just why it is additionally bad that these for people moving into those communities is that diaspora communities are an incredibly culturally safe space. And I know that this is taking a higher burden than what we got at our opening. They say that, for example, children might want to aspire to a majority cultural group, or that maybe because they are fragmented, it is harder. We give you more of the concrete mechanisms here that I think ought to be credited. The first is that when you're in a small community that just doesn't have enough people to do the organizing of certain events, for example, festivals and so on. For example, you don't have enough people to build the church of your faith that is particularly important to you. That makes it incredibly hard to establish those sorts of things. But secondly, you're much more likely to face opposition for that, because again, still the people who are in power are probably the richer, generally white people. They are the ones who are going to oppose festivals because they are too noisy. They oppose the planning of a mosque in that community because it's something they don't want. That is something that's incredibly hard for you to access your culture. But additionally, we explain the fact that there is less representation because that voting power doesn't exist anymore. Representatives don't compete over minorities wanting better things in their community. There is no reason or incentive to engage in what those communities want. This is going to be an incredibly bad thing for the first generation that moves in there. The most immediate impact, very proud to oppose.
Thanks, opposition member. Government Webb.
Cool, just checking that I'm audible. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Yeah.
If you just want me to do it with Zoom so we can type in POIs.
Sorry, I can't really hear you from there.
you just give us 1 minute to join the Zoom so we can type POIs in the chat.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
Just like, I'll type POI when you guys are ready, and then you can take it, just speak on the front. Yeah.
That's all good. Thank you.
Cool, I'm good to go.
Yeah.
Sweet. Firstly, CO, then our extension, then OG, then OO. In terms of CO, I think that as that member admits, this is a short-term impact. And so obviously just on the way in, we tell you that we're able to get people to move into suburbs that are going to have house prices accumulate over time, that have higher paying jobs, that your family and your descendants are able to have for many, many generations. Obviously that benefit applies to far more people over 200, 250 years, as opposed to the maybe like 5,000 people that get impacted by not having like a good enough train line at the point where they move. So I don't think it's the most important thing in this debate. But I also just want to challenge that there aren't going to be all of these services for poorer people as CO tries to claim. The first thing to note is obviously the government has an incentive to do this well because they don't want backlash against their policy. So they're likely to do things like, sure, we accept that it's required, but obviously you're going to give support at the same time. So it means that if this is an area with really expensive rents, then you give a rent subsidy. If this is a group that's able to afford to get that's able to afford to get a mortgage, then the government offers them a lower interest mortgage than the banks would do. The second thing to note is that we don't have to stand by this policy like being implemented today. We're happy to build the public school in the Sydney eastern suburbs before we have people move over. I think that means that that the harms they try to say aren't going to apply to many people. The next thing I just want to note, though, is that obviously we're not going to be sending the poorest people of these minority communities to the most expensive suburbs of these majority communities. We stand by, I think the most likely way that this would be implemented is that obviously a middle-class Black person who now gets a bit of government support and now has the ability to move to that really nice suburb that they've always wanted to is going to move to the expensive suburb, whereas the lower socioeconomic status person is going to go to the poor white area. I think that it's completely absurd for them to stand by like the poorest people moving to the most expensive suburbs. That doesn't make any sense. The next thing to say is that, sure, we accept that these suburbs are more expensive, but as Mannat says to no response, the reason that they're more expensive is because you're paying for higher wages, and now that you're in this area, you get a higher paying job. So that means that when your cafe pays you $25 an hour as opposed to $15 an hour, then sure, your supermarket bill is more expensive, but you're able to afford it and you've got a little bit of leftover money that you're able to put towards your retirement, put towards your saving. That's really important. Let's then go over our extension and why this was the most important thing in this debate. The first thing I want to note is that there was no engagement with Mannat's principle that should go before any of the practical impacts, because she explains that a lot of this land was either directly stolen or was used really manipulative tactics, like saying that we're going to build a motorway or an airport to force you off of this land. Doing this policy is able to get people back to those cultural homelands. And this is really important because that's where you probably do have historic buildings that you would like to be able to see when you walk past every day to work. We're now able to give that to these people. That's really important. No engagement with that. But the other part of our extension that was really important is Mannat explained how things like redlining means that minorities were locked out of the desirable suburbs, and importantly, these desirable suburbs are the ones that rise in value as people want to live there. OO tries to say that this is harmful because it's gentrification, but that's not good enough for two things. Firstly, obviously we have fear. The government wants this policy to be implemented well, so they're going to do things like give you a cheap mortgage in order to incentivize you to come. But secondly, it's just factually correct that a majority of people own their house, and therefore gentrification is a benefit to these people, not a harm, because their price rises in value. That's really beneficial. Why is this so beneficial? Because of the fact that currently minority communities are locked out of these very desirable suburbs that will have the values increase over time, that means that it affects your ability to sell your house to retire a few years earlier. It affects your ability to get a reverse mortgage on that house, to send your kids to like a $70,000 private university to get your tuition through that. That's really important because that does limit the access that minority communities have to increased wealth and to better jobs. What I want to note about this is that obviously this is more important than anything that other teams have said in this debate. Because firstly, when you are a poorer community because you are locked out of things like this, that leads to the worst types of racial stereotypes. So we beat OG in terms of not just microaggressions, but the most malicious of these stereotypes. But also, just I think very obviously, it's incredibly beneficial to have extra money that you can use in order to support your family, in order to support your community. The next thing I want to say on this is just that your daily quality of life also massively improves. I think this is a flip of CO because obviously the suburbs that are desirable have a better quality of life. It was just an assertion that they have a worse quality of life. The only mechanism for it is it's more expensive, but I already dealt with that as to why you have more money. Let's explain why we weigh over OG. Two things to note. They tell you about contact theory, but as we tell you, at the best case of both of our cases, I think obviously the economic benefit is more important than decreasing microaggressions. But I think the second thing to note is that opposition puts doubt on the working of contact theory due to backlash from job losses. I don't think there were sufficient responses that OG gives you to the OO case for that. Let's now deal with the OO material and explain why we were able to beat that. The first thing they have a few claims. The first is that you're not going to integrate well. I just think that backlash isn't likely, as now you rely on these people for your local services. So if your kid's teacher is Black and they think that she is a good teacher and you want your kid to succeed, so you're not going to say that, oh, this person must be a really bad teacher. Obviously, that means that because they now are in your community and are working jobs that you rely on for your day-to-day life, that means that you're really happy that they're there. You think that you wouldn't be able to have your mail delivered if they weren't there. You think that you think that you wouldn't be able to get your coffee made if they weren't there. That's really crucial because it means that especially over time, you actually are incredibly likely to think that they are a vital part of your community. And so I think it's incredibly unlikely that you do get this backlash that they try and say. In terms of political power, I think OG dealt with this. Things like gerrymandering mean that currently you have less political power. Obviously, we flip this by removing that ability for that to happen. And in terms of them destroying minority communities, Mannat already dealt with this. But obviously, this debate is not about two people moving to a white area. It's about setting the proportions to be equal. So if 20% of your country's population is Black, then you're with a lot of other Black people and still have that culture.
Thanks, government win, opposition win. And a reminder first speakers to take the PYs before for engagement.
At the point at which the government accepts that people don't want to move, that you have to jack up these subsidies so high to encourage people to actually move, that is the massive amount of fiat we get under side opposition to actually improve these local communities, to instead invest in public schools, not in rich white areas where people are already priced out, but in these local areas where they keep their community benefits, where they keep their voting power, and where they are actually able to build these kind of communities and don't subject to all the harms we tell you. Okay, I'm going to go through team by team, first CG, then OG, then explaining how we unlock some of the benefits of our OO. I'm going to talk about our material integrating with CG. Firstly, dealing with reparations, noting that we should give a response here. They've mentioned that it's good for colonizers to move off the land. Three responses to this. Firstly, you're moving the wrong people into the land, right? Noting that you have to subsidize these things. You don't exactly get to move the exact correct Native American tribe into the land they lost, right? Those are different movements. You're not doing the correct reparations. It doesn't matter if I go to land stolen by someone else. That doesn't
doesn't fix colonialism. Secondly, it works both ways, right? You also have to take white people onto Native American lands and onto lands they had before. You are ruining that benefit here. And finally, on weighing, we think community connection just matters more here. It is more important for you to stay connected to your local community and your local people, like things like this. No, thank you. Cool. Okay, secondly, on housing and economics. The main push from CG is that you get proximity to good jobs, which means you get higher incomes. 5 sets of responses to this. Firstly, I think we tell you at Niamh that the problem here is a mismatch in skills, right? Because if you're from a poor area and a minority group, you're less likely to have the kind of higher skill education to try and have the jobs that exist in that kind of community. That means there are very few jobs available to you, right? They're probably working in like high-tech startup firms and stuff you're literally just priced out of. Secondly, racism still exists. You're probably not likely to get hired in a bunch of places because people are racist and see your CV and see where you went to school and say, let's not hire this person. That's not good. Thirdly, the CG then has to accept a massive amount of economic segregation, at which point they say that, oh no, it'll just be the rich minority people who move into these areas where the poor minority people keep in the poor minorities areas. That is a massive harm socially if you're not enforcing this economic segregation and you lose a lot of the benefits because you only benefit the most advantaged minority groups there, not the worst off. Fourthly, under this, Niamh tells you how you are priced out of these rich communities. We tell you how you have things like higher grocery prices, you have less access to bulk billing, you have less access to things like public schools. What do we get in response? They say, oh great, we'll just build more public schools. Firstly, does not respond to the idea that prices are generally higher, right? Groceries are higher because people demand fancier goods. People have different tastes and preferences here. Secondly, if you have building public schools in these areas, why not, under our side of the house, we have the fiat, build them in these areas or these local communities already without moving people around and forcing them to move and things like this. No, thank you. Cool. Yeah, awesome. Actually, yeah, I will take opening.
Both of their cases are a combination of model bashing and short-term concerns. Under OG, the most oppressed and vulnerable minorities are always going to be better communities with better infrastructure, with wealthier people, with their communities, and racism would decrease into the long run.
Awesome. Let's talk about OG and their contact hypothesis, because I think our bench has clearly shown how this contact just simply does not work, right? You do not have the people, you have competition, as we point out in a POI early on, you have competition over these subsidies. You have people moving into your communities, which means you don't have the kind of positive equal status contact that they want. In fact, Niamh tells you in her second point, how you still have these lack of access to cultural groups, and you don't have the kind of integration in the communities that they want. Cool. What is OG's other push? OG's other push is equality. But OG really struggles at the point in which they say, oh yes, people just move in and out of these neighborhoods at the same rate. Obviously not, right? Beverly Hills is still Beverly Hills. You're not magically going to get people to be able to move into these kind of communities just because you are you're giving people subsidies. The kind of things OG wants to claim as like, oh, we can just make policy that is good for all. But as we point out in a POI, right? You can't make policy that just benefits everyone and harms no one, right? These are specific groups with specific interests. We tell you why these people are not dealt with properly and do not have the voting rights and abilities to deal with this. Cool. So yeah, OG, by propping up these subsidies, show that we have the fiat under our side of the house to actually address these kind of things and to deal with them. Cool. What have we told you here? No, thank you. Just flagging how we now going to OO, how we unlock some of the benefits of OO. Because I think when we show that and we prove why there will be so much economic hardship, we prove how there will be very few people who actually want to move into these wealthy white communities. What happens at that point? What happens is exactly as CG has agreed to, or as OG said in a POI, you have to jack up these subsidies. What does that mean? At the point at which this policy is not actually getting enough people into the communities, OG government is not meeting their burden, which means that they do have to stand by things like forcibly moving people to different communities, like actually requiring that people shift communities. So what have we done? We're not model bashing here. We're providing structural reasons why the model does not achieve its aims and thus must be stronger, and thus unlocking the benefits of OO, who talk about how it's hard, you'll get backlash because you're forcing people to move. We show you the structural economic reasons why people do not want to move and why that has to exist in that case. Cool. Awesome. What else? How else do we get over our OO? OO talks about gentrification, but never really thinks about how gentrification works both ways, right? It's not just rich people moving into poor areas. It's poor people who are poor ethnic communities who have to move into richer areas. That is the gentrification we talk about, and those are the kind of problems we have. Cool. I'll take closing if you have one.
Can you please engage with all of the material we give you about how it is beneficial to be in a wealthy area because over time you're able to accrue the benefit of house prices increasing?
Yeah, awesome. Let's talk about how you get benefits over time. Because even in richer areas, right, there are still better streets and worse streets. These racial minorities are likely to be people who move into the worst areas. But also, as I've already proved in rebuttal here, right, you don't get that foot in the door, right? You don't get those initial jobs. You're struggling to pay the bills because you can't afford groceries because prices are so high. We don't think you get the overall benefits and the accruing kind of wealth that government wants to talk about because you simply don't get the foot in the door. Let's be comparative here. What do you get under our side? With all their fiat, you get better public schools in minority communities. You get better access to culturally specific resources and like community centers that these people want. And you have jobs coming into these communities to help these communities develop and build up. So we conclusively prove how these communities, the people are inherently harmed by moving into these richer neighborhoods and priced out, why segregation is terrible for these kind of cultures. And for those reasons, vote CO.